The world was struck with a deep wave of emotion as news broke from the Vatican: the Pope had passed away. It wasn't just the loss of a spiritual leader, but the end of a chapter for millions of Catholics around the globe. His final days had been marked by quiet reflection, and although his health had been declining, the confirmation of his death brought a heavy stillness to the heart of the Church. As the sun set over St. Peter's Basilica, bells tolled solemnly across Rome, announcing to the faithful that the Holy Father had gone to meet his Creator. Outside the Vatican walls, people began to gather, in silence, in prayer, and in shared grief. For many, he wasn't just a religious figure, he was a symbol of compassion, humility, and guidance through some of the most challenging times in recent history. Inside the Vatican, a delicate and sacred protocol was immediately set in motion. The Camerlengo, the cardinal appointed to oversee the Church in this transitional time, officially confirmed the Pope's death in a ceremonial act steeped in centuries-old tradition. His duty was not only administrative but deeply symbolic, marking the end of a papal reign and the beginning of the Church's temporary state known as sede vacant, the vacant seat. In the days that followed, the Church entered a period of mourning known as the Novendiales, 9 days of solemn liturgies and reflection. Each day, cardinals, bishops, and the faithful gathered to remember the Pope's life, his service, and his message. These rites not only honored his legacy but spiritually prepared the Church for what would come next: the election of a new pontiff. Behind the scenes, the College of Cardinals began to quietly coordinate. This elite group of senior Church officials, many of whom had been appointed by the late Pope himself, now held the responsibility of choosing his successor. It was a weighty task, filled with prayer, deliberation, and global attention. The Church's future would soon rest in the hands of 120 men tasked with hearing the voice of the Holy Spirit. Meanwhile, the Vatican Media Center became a hive of activity. Journalists from every corner of the world arrived to cover the unfolding story. Cameras zoomed in on the Vatican windows, commentators speculated on possible successors, and crowds of pilgrims filled the square. There was uncertainty in the air, but also a quiet sense of hope, a belief that the Church, as it always had, would find its way forward. Security around the Vatican tightened as preparations began for the next stage, the Conclave. The Sistine Chapel, rich with Michelangelo's frescoes and guarded by layers of secrecy, would soon host the most sacred election process in the world. Workers installed technical countermeasures to ensure no outside communication could interfere. What was about to happen would be done in absolute privacy, guided by prayer, tradition, and centuries of history. For many Catholics, this was a time of unity. Parishes held special vigils. Candles were lit across cathedrals from Buenos Aires to Manila. It was a reminder that the Church is not just an institution, it's a global family. And though their shepherd was gone, faith remained steady. A new light, they believed, would rise again soon. Social media became flooded with memories of the late Pope. Videos of his speeches, moments of tenderness with children, his humble acts of service all resurfaced as people around the world paid tribute. Some mourned quietly. Others wrote long reflections. But all expressed gratitude. Whether they agreed with every decision or not, most could not deny the spiritual and moral strength of the man now gone. As the 9th day of mourning approached, the final liturgy of the Novendiales echoed through the marble halls of St. Peter's Basilica. And when it ended, a new anticipation began. The world turned its gaze to the ancient doors of the Sistine Chapel. The time had come to choose a new shepherd. As the bells of Rome tolled their final lament in memory of Pope Francis, a new sense of anticipation rippled through the heart of the Vatican. The College of Cardinals, numbering over 100 eligible electors from around the globe, prepared for one of the most solemn and sacred duties in the Roman Catholic Church, the election of a new pontiff. Cloaked in secrecy and tradition, these cardinals began arriving in the Eternal City, each bearing the weight of history and the hopes of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Hotels in the Borgo district filled with clerical delegates and international press, all aware that the world's gaze was now firmly set on the Sistine Chapel. The spiritual and political complexities surrounding this conclave were unlike those of the past. Pope Francis had been a reformer, challenging traditional structures and promoting inclusivity, compassion, and environmental stewardship. His death not only left a leadership void but also reopened long-standing theological and ideological tensions within the Church. From the progressive voices seeking continuation of Francis's reforms to conservative factions longing for a return to orthodoxy, the conclave would be as much a spiritual discernment as a reflection of the Church's future direction. On the eve of the conclave, Vatican officials performed the ceremonial ritual of extra omnes, which literally means all out. All non-essential personnel were ushered from the Sistine Chapel, leaving only the cardinal electors within its fresco-covered walls. Guards closed the doors with a resounding thud, sealing the cardinals inside, away from the world. Within those sacred walls, technology was disabled, communication severed, and centuries-old traditions resumed. No one, not even the press with its satellite cameras and seasoned Vatican watchers, could predict how long the conclave would last or who might emerge as the new Bishop of Rome. Outside, pilgrims held vigil in St. Peter's Square, clutching rosaries and flickering candles, their faces etched with quiet reverence and hope. Some had traveled thousands of miles, just to be near the heart of the Church at this historic moment. Journalists from every continent filed hourly updates, speculating on front-runners, alliances, and voting blocs. Names such as Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, Cardinal Zuppi from Italy, and Cardinal Turkson from Ghana circulated widely, each embodying a different theological and geographical vision for the Church. As voting began, black smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, signaling to the world that no consensus had yet been reached. The sight was both dramatic and humbling, a reminder that discernment, especially one of such magnitude, could not be rushed. Inside, the cardinals prayed, debated, and cast their ballots. Each vote was solemnly read aloud, counted, and then burned. The room was thick with incense and contemplation, as well as the tension of a world awaiting white smoke. The process was deeply spiritual, yet intensely human. Behind the silence of the Sistine Chapel doors lay not only prayers but conversations about doctrine, diplomacy, and the Church's role in modern society. Some cardinals favored continuity, a pope who would deepen the work Francis had begun. Others wanted change, believing the Church needed firmer moral authority and clearer doctrine. The diversity of opinion underscored the global nature of the Church, where the concerns of a bishop in Brazil might differ vastly from those of one in Poland or Nigeria. On the third day, the smoke that curled from the chapel chimney took on a different hue. For a moment, spectators strained their eyes, was it black or white? Then, unmistakably, a cheer erupted from the crowd. White smoke. Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica began to ring joyfully, reverberating through the streets of Rome and into the hearts of millions worldwide. The moment had come, one of the most iconic in religious and global history. Tension turned into excitement as the faithful looked toward the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica. The red curtains, drawn since the conclave began, now rustled. Moments later, the Cardinal Protodeacon stepped onto the balcony and delivered the traditional announcement. The name of the new pope was declared, an unfamiliar yet powerful moment, as viewers around the world held their breath in recognition and reflection. In an instant, a new chapter of Catholic history had begun. When the new pope finally stepped forward, the crowd erupted. His presence was humble yet firm, his face both joyful and contemplative. He gave his first Urbi et Orbi blessing, not only to Rome but to the world. His choice of papal name, a nod to a past saint or perhaps a predecessor, offered subtle clues about the direction he might lead the Church. Cameras flashed, tears streamed down faces, and social media exploded with reactions. The world now had a new spiritual shepherd. But questions lingered. Who was this man behind the white cassock? What vision would he bring to a Church both venerable and vulnerable? The task ahead was immense, restoring unity, confronting scandals, deepening faith in an era of skepticism. As he turned and disappeared back into the basilica, one thing was clear: a new journey had begun, one rooted in centuries of tradition yet pressing boldly into the future. The global stage was fully awakened to the significance of the moment. As the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV unfolded, millions who had felt adrift since the death of Pope Francis now sensed a new spiritual compass emerging. This was not just a ceremonial transition, it was an event layered with deep emotional and cultural significance. Catholic communities from diverse regions, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Philippines, Eastern Europe, saw themselves reflected in the Pope's inclusive words and intentional gestures. His message, echoing through the cobbled streets of Vatican City and across digital platforms, was simple: we are one body, many voices, all loved. In that single sentence, he began to chart the vision of his papacy. Behind the scenes, the work of renewal had already begun. Pope Leo XIV declined the traditional Vatican apartment, opting instead to remain in the guesthouse where Pope Francis had lived, continuing the precedent of modesty. He requested a detailed audit of the Vatican Bank, signaling a continuation of the push for financial transparency. Senior cardinals were summoned for one-on-one meetings. Many were surprised at the Pope's precise knowledge of regional crises and his direct, warm style. There was no pomp in the room, just a man in white, listening, taking notes, and offering quiet counsel. He asked hard questions, but always with kindness, something Vatican insiders had not always experienced. Public reaction remained intense and emotional. In countries affected by recent humanitarian crises, from war zones to areas devastated by climate events, the Pope's initial statements of solidarity struck a deep chord. He mentioned Sudan, Ukraine, Myanmar, and Gaza within his first 48 hours as pontiff, sparking headlines worldwide. In Rome, lines to enter St. Peter's Basilica stretched for blocks, as pilgrims sought to leave handwritten prayers and candles by the new Pope's image. On social media, hashtags like hashtag Pope Leo XIV and hashtag New Hope for the Church trended globally. The Church, often criticized as distant or outdated, suddenly felt deeply present again. His early days were not just filled with symbolic acts but decisive actions. He reinstated a commission on sexual abuse cases that had been inactive in recent months, adding lay experts and victims' advocates to the advisory board. He appointed 2 women to senior roles within the Vatican, fulfilling a promise made during his time as Archbishop. He also reached out to ecumenical and interfaith leaders, holding private calls with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the Chief Rabbi of Rome, and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. These gestures were not mere photo opportunities, they were the seeds of a church striving to be a bridge in a fractured world. Each day brought new headlines, and each one revealed more of the Pope's personality: his early morning walks in the Vatican gardens, his spontaneous blessing of street cleaners, his visit to a refugee center just outside Rome. During one unexpected moment, he stopped a motorcade to embrace a disabled boy in a wheelchair, prompting a tidal wave of emotional responses online. These weren't orchestrated moments for the cameras, they were deeply rooted in who he was. This was a shepherd who didn't need to remind the world of his authority, he was too busy showing his humanity. In many ways, Pope Leo XIV was still finding his voice. His daily homilies during early morning masses at Casa Santa Marta, delivered to a modest congregation of Vatican workers and gardeners, became instant sources of reflection. Transcripts circulated in multiple languages within hours. His words, gentle but firm, spoke to universal themes: forgiveness, social justice, inclusion, and the sacred dignity of every human life. He invoked stories from his own childhood, his years in ministry, even anecdotes about doubt and fatigue. He seemed unafraid to appear vulnerable, and in doing so, he made the papacy feel approachable again. The international press, initially cautious, began drawing comparisons. Editorials called him a man of the people, a listener, and a pope for a new century. But others issued notes of caution. Some traditionalist circles feared he would accelerate reforms too quickly. Critics questioned whether his emphasis on decentralizing church governance might lead to theological inconsistency. And yet, the Pope remained undistracted. His public statements avoided polarization. He repeated again and again that the Church's mission was to serve, not to control. To heal wounds, not to inflame divisions. Let the Church be a field hospital, he said, echoing the words of Pope Francis, where all are welcome. In diplomatic circles, the Vatican was quickly becoming a hub of renewed relevance. Ambassadors lined up for audiences. Leaders of nations facing moral crises turned to Rome for counsel, not just ceremony. Pope Leo XIV emphasized diplomacy of the heart, offering the moral weight of the Church not to interfere, but to inspire peace and dialogue. When asked by a journalist what political platform he supported, he responded simply, "I support the gospel." It was this refusal to be boxed in that made him both hard to define and impossible to ignore. In seminaries and religious houses around the world, young clergy and students discussed him with passion. For many, he was already a source of vocational renewal. Enrollment in religious orders had waned in recent decades, but the arrival of a pope so clearly rooted in prayer, service, and humility was having a noticeable effect. Vocations directors reported increased inquiries. Catholic universities hosted live streams and panels dissecting his messages. Even lapsed Catholics, those who had drifted away over decades, began to express cautious interest. "Maybe this church still has a place for me," one tweet read, echoing thousands of similar sentiments. And yet, amid the global excitement and admiration, Pope Leo XIV maintained a startling sense of calm. He refused to be treated as a celebrity. During his second week in office, he slipped out of the Vatican unannounced, disguised in a simple black cassock, and visited a shelter in Trastevere where he had once volunteered years before. The staff were stunned to see him at the door, serving meals and listening to stories as if no cameras were watching. When a staffer asked why he came, he simply replied, "Because Christ is already here." In moments like this, the world began to see not just the head of a church, but the beating heart of a servant leader. Back in Latin America, where Pope Leo XIV had begun his pastoral life decades earlier, an emotional homecoming of sorts was unfolding. Though he now resided within the walls of the Vatican, his spiritual imprint remained visible across the barrios and parishes he once served. Local priests spoke of a Leo effect. Parish attendance was climbing, young people were organizing prayer groups again, and social justice ministries had found new energy. His concern for the poor wasn't just symbolic, it had roots and lived experience. Communities remembered his visits to makeshift clinics, his hours spent blessing the sick in slums, and his commitment to education for underprivileged youth. Now, with one of their own in the highest spiritual office, hope had returned. In Rome, Vatican security was facing new levels of demand. The Pope's preference for spontaneity, his unscheduled outings and unannounced visits, challenged traditional protocol. Behind closed doors, the Swiss Guard and Vatican gendarmerie had to adapt rapidly. They introduced flexible escort teams and more agile communication channels, knowing that Pope Leo's style could not, and would not, be boxed into rigid ceremonial structures. He was always on the move, often unaccompanied by large entourages, shaking hands with tourists, comforting the elderly, or simply pausing to pray in public. For many, it was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking to witness such unfiltered closeness. Meanwhile, within the walls of the Vatican, the College of Cardinals observed the early days of his pontificate with a blend of admiration and cautious curiosity. Some senior members found comfort in his pastoral warmth, while others were still adjusting to the speed and direction of his reforms. Liturgical commissions were quietly reassessing how local bishops could be given greater autonomy without compromising unity. Discussions about the role of women in decision-making spaces had picked up pace, fueled by the Pope's call for a church that listens with both ears. Change was in the air, respectful, measured, but undeniably real. Media outlets began launching weekly specials on Pope Leo XIV's teachings. Television crews from secular and religious networks covered his speeches with breathless anticipation. Catholic publications scrambled to translate his homilies into dozens of languages. But beyond the headlines, it was ordinary people who were writing the real story through blogs, podcasts, art, and prayer circles. In Africa, youth leaders praised his acknowledgement of the continent's growing role in Catholicism. In Europe, elderly parishioners felt a sense of rebirth in their faith. Across the ocean in Canada and the US, immigrants said they finally saw a pope who understood their journey. One of the first major theological reflections of Pope Leo XIV centered on mercy not as weakness, but as divine strength. He drew from the writings of saints and mystics to remind the church that the face of God was not a judge with a gavel, but a father waiting for his prodigal children. This message resonated deeply in prisons, hospitals, and rehabilitation centers. Catholic chaplains reported increases in confession and spiritual counseling. Pope Leo's consistent refrain, "God does not tire of forgiving, we tire of asking," spread through social media like wildfire. To many, it felt like spiritual oxygen after years of suffocating guilt or apathy. The Pope also began to shift the Church's tone on ecology, building upon the foundations laid by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. He called for a sacramental vision of nature, inviting believers to see the earth not just as creation, but as communion. He encouraged bishops' conferences to develop regional climate action plans, particularly in coastal and drought-prone regions. In a dramatic gesture, he planted an olive tree in the Vatican gardens on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, surrounded by children from 5 continents. "May this tree outlive us all," he said, "and remind the Church that we are stewards, not owners." But not all responses were harmonious. In conservative theological circles, debates reignited around doctrinal clarity. Was the Pope being too lenient? Too open? Some feared that his pastoral approach might blur boundaries of moral teaching. Others applauded him for separating sin from shame, for focusing on the sinner's journey rather than casting condemnation. The Pope addressed these tensions with characteristic gentleness, saying in one sermon, "Truth does not need a sword, it needs a heart willing to suffer for it." It was a response that pacified some, but stirred further reflection in others. In the digital realm, the Vatican launched a revitalized media platform under Pope Leo's direction. Branded as Faith Alive, it offered daily reflections, visual stories of hope, and interactive catechesis tailored to a younger, mobile-first audience. The Pope himself occasionally contributed handwritten notes or spontaneous voice messages. His voice, kind, unpolished, deeply personal, reminded listeners of a priest who had never forgotten his flock. The platform attracted millions of followers within weeks, crossing generational and geographical boundaries. For the first time in a long time, the Church felt not only present but present day. Religious orders, too, found themselves reinvigorated. The Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, and even contemplative monasteries noted a rising interest in retreats and novitiate programs. Pope Leo had placed spiritual discernment at the center of his early papacy, and his own contemplative depth inspired others to slow down and listen to God in silence. Vocational fairs and spiritual weekends, once underattended, began drawing young professionals, students, and even skeptics. Something had shifted. The call to holiness no longer seemed like an unreachable ideal but a daily invitation to love more courageously. Amid all this renewal, Pope Leo XIV remained anchored in prayer. His daily schedule, though full, always made room for long hours in the chapel. He often knelt quietly before the Eucharist, hands folded, brows furrowed in concentration. Observers noted the intensity of those silent moments as though the weight of the world had found a resting place. It was there, in the quiet mystery of faith, that he found the strength to continue. And though the challenges ahead were many, the world had begun to believe in something it desperately needed, a hope not born of politics or power, but of humility, love, and divine conviction. As the months passed, Pope Leo XIV's influence reached beyond the walls of the Church. Political leaders from both liberal and conservative spectrums began referencing his calls for justice and compassion in parliamentary sessions and international forums. While he refused to become a political figure, his moral clarity was impossible to ignore. He met with presidents, activists, indigenous leaders, and refugees, not behind bulletproof glass, but often face to face, listening far more than he spoke. He believed diplomacy was not about power, but about presence, and his presence alone softened even hardened hearts. Back inside the Vatican, his reforms began to show fruit. Bishops' conferences reported increased collaboration and localized outreach. A pilot program he approved to allow for synodal discussions in remote parishes brought voices from the Amazon, Arctic, and African deserts into dialogue with the Roman Curia. His emphasis on a listening church had become more than a phrase, it was a movement. pilgrims visiting Rome began reporting that even low-level Vatican staff seemed more joyful, more engaged. Something had changed, not just structurally, but spiritually. The Pope's relationship with youth was another hallmark. During World Youth Day in Manila, he drew over 6 million participants, more than any papal gathering in modern history. His address, delivered barefoot on a rain-soaked stage, went viral. "You are not the future of the Church. You are its heartbeat today." The crowd erupted in cheers, and a moment of collective silence followed. No music, no speeches, just the sound of a million prayers echoing under gray skies. The world saw faith not as ritual, but as revolution. In Jerusalem, he walked alongside a rabbi and a Muslim cleric to the Western Wall, each placing their hands on the stone together in silence. It was a gesture of breathtaking symbolism: 3 faiths, 1 wall, no words. Across interfaith communities, the images were hailed as prophetic. Pope Leo had made it clear that dialogue was not compromise, it was courage. The Vatican's Office for Interreligious Affairs, often considered peripheral, suddenly found itself at the center of papal strategy. And the Church's mission felt once again universal, not institutional. But not all events were filled with peace. In a small African village devastated by militia violence, the Pope made an unannounced visit. He held the hands of mothers who had lost children, prayed over graves, and stood silent before burned-out churches. Local clergy later revealed he wept openly in private, overwhelmed not by doubt, but by empathy. "These are the wounds of Christ today," he said to his aides. His travel itinerary rarely included tourist-friendly cathedrals, it followed pain, need, and the unseen margins of the world. As his first year in the papacy came to a close, the Church began its own renewal, not forced by policy, but inspired by example. Vocations rose, confession lines lengthened, and charitable donations spiked. But more importantly, hope returned. In seminaries, students studied his writings on mercy. In poor parishes, priests quoted his teachings on joy. Even skeptics admitted something rare was happening: a spiritual leader had entered a cynical age and not just survived, but illuminated it. During his Christmas address, Pope Leo XIV stood before a crowd of tens of thousands under flickering candlelight. He spoke not of politics, nor doctrine, but of longing. "The world," he said, "is not in need of more answers, it is in need of more love. And the Church will not rest until that love becomes flesh in every corner of the earth." There were no fireworks, no applause, just silence, deep and reverent. The kind of silence that only comes when hearts are listening. In private, the Pope kept a journal. Few knew it existed, but his confessor revealed that in it, he wrote prayers for the world's most forgotten souls: orphans, prisoners, widows, addicts. His papacy, though young, was being shaped not by history's demands but by heaven's whispers. And while critics debated his policies, no one could deny the authenticity of his love. As the bells of Rome rang on the anniversary of his coronation, a sense of destiny seemed to hang in the air. Pope Leo XIV had begun not just a papacy, but a pilgrimage. He had reminded the world that holiness was not a performance, but a presence. That leadership was not dominance, but servanthood. And that the Church, even after centuries, still had new songs to sing. The story of Pope Leo XIV had only just begun. But already, the world was leaning in, not to worship a man, but to follow the light he carried. If you found this story powerful and inspiring, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'll keep bringing you stories that matter. Thank you for watching.